education that you get from NOMMA. Tyler Bray, your presenter, and we'll just take off and run with it.
Thank you. My name is Tyler Bray. I work for a company called FMI. Folks in the room have heard of our organization before, anybody? So a few folks. Basically what we do, David reminded me kind of the interim between the last session. I didn't really tell you who I was. But FMI has been around the construction industry for 50 years. Started in 1953. Management, consulting, and investment banking firm. And so basically, we work directly with contractors on a whole host of different items. And so I work on the consulting side of the business. And what that means for my role is typically I'm on the road 150, 200 days a year. The majority of which I spend sitting inside the contractors' offices, helping them think through some of the more complex business challenges as it pertains to competitive strategy, business development, or what we like to call project execution, which is really how we define overall operations of the business and really executing work efficiently and controlling costs. And so I probably spend most of my time in the project execution space helping self-performing contractors make more money off the existing work they have, essentially. How to focus in on this idea of driving and or improving productivity for folks that were in the room the last hour. That's what we just touched on, some of the economic either opportunities or consequences we could have if we're not focusing on productivity. A big component of that, and a big component of a successful, well-oiled machine from a construction operation is this idea of accurate estimating, right? Having accurate job costs, because that's ultimately what we're signing up for, contractually, we're on the hook for that. And so, how many folks here do we have that are estimators? So a good majority of estimators, right? So you came to the right session here. So, what are some challenges that you guys have around estimating? Just want to kind of throw it out there and see if you guys have any particular pain points that you want to either for me to touch on or for we can get feedback from the group on this afternoon. Yes, sir.
One of the biggest challenges is understanding, number one, the scope of the work. Since in order to have such strict engineering calculations and specifications, is what is the real material and it is really going to be needed among the engineering.
Okay, so specification-wise, what is actually going to be required on the project?
Because I believe the engineers, and no respect to the engineers, they just believe
We'll start
they That's just
so over-engineering.
But there must be hundreds of thousands of millions of really great engineers.
Your experience. Just people that you know.
Experience as engineers overkill.
Yeah. What about you, Bruce?
Yeah, one of our biggest challenges are because we do so many different types of complex projects. You can't really use a repeatable database that, hey, it's like this job. You maybe get 60% of the activities that we did before and track that, and you get close, but at the end of the day, we're still really guesstimating. And unfortunately, if you throw too much fat at it, you don't get the profit. But if you don't throw enough fat at it, you're going to perhaps lose money on the deal. So, it's not like a structural steel company where you're processing red iron, complexity maybe simple, complex, throw ratio data. I mean, when you're doing a lot of different kind of projects, none ever been done before, it's real difficult to extract man hours. At least that's the problem I have.
The niche markets with specialty work that's non-repetitious, and probably you do one of them and then you move on, and you might not see that type of work for another 5 years, or maybe never even again for some particular project. So I think, Bruce, you hit on a good point there, though, is that we could probably get 60% of it, though, right? And I think that's kind of the stuff we'll talk about here today, some best practices around it. Obviously, you guys are the expertise in that area, and I don't, when it comes to those really complex, specific tasks, and I don't tend to know, the skill that goes into that. But we will talk about from a management standpoint. what are some good practices around making sure that when we're counting widgets and counting beams, so to speak, what are some things that make sure that whatever we're doing in that arena, we're getting the most out of our efforts. So to speak. We're not, we can track a whole lot of things, right? Is it valuable to track it? There's probably a point of diminishing returns, right? When we say, hey, we want to track every little widget, every little man hour, and make sure that we account for each person and their time in our organization. There's a point of diminishing returns where we say we're spending more money tracking stuff than we are saving by tracking it and understanding where we're at. That's different for each organization. There's kind of a continuum that says, here's kind of where we need to be. I'll tell you, what we're going to focus on here this afternoon is that at a minimum, we've got those repeatable core activities that we do on a lot of projects. If we can track those at a minimum, track them accurately, and have solid business intelligence around that, that will give us an advantage over most folks. And we still have that area. We'll talk about contingency here in a little bit. But we got to figure out what's happening here, connecting actual job costs back to estimating. So here's a little exercise I just kind of run through with you guys. I like to start off with kind of a fill in the blank test. You knew there was going to be a test at some point. What gets managed is what gets, so I see you already said that. Gave me the answer. What gets measured is what gets managed. Or some people say, what gets measured is what gets done. Some people say that. You can't manage what you don't measure. I would say that's pretty accurate. Measure the things that you want to manage. Okay. Get a little repetitive here. Merely measuring something has a tendency to improve it, manage it. Yeah. So just focusing on it, right? I think you can't manage what you don't measure. That's absolutely true. I see organizations all the time that says, I need my guys to focus on this stuff more, or improve our productivity, or to tighten up around change orders, or to do something different in the business, but without a whole lot of information on, how big is the problem, what's the severity, how would you go about changing it. There's not a whole lot of metrics to base it in, other than, hey, I think we're losing money here, and it feels like we're getting sideways. But we don't have a lot of objective data to say this is what's actually happening. Here's what we can specifically do to tackle those problems. So, what are some things that that y'all like to measure on a job? What are some things that you track?
Control.
Okay.
Today.
What do you track though? Is it man hours, or you're tracking material costs? What else? Okay, there's labor costs. So we got man hours, and then we got our blend. What are some other things you guys are tracking? Overhead. So we got to make sure that depending on how we cost out overhead, that philosophy is different in each organization. But that's certainly we got to keep the lights on, so to speak, and pay for the administrative and managerial folks that make the organization run outside of physically producing work. What else do you got to track? Okay, how do you track the difficulty of the project?
Well, like he was saying, we could get some annual specialty jobs.
One off.
Sometimes with the
Right. So a lot of head scratching and maybe some dart throwing involved, right? Because we don't really know what's in there. Some folks might go ahead.
The specs today, like we have a certain vision, 5,500, we're going to 700. But in those specs today, they started adding the lead general specs. Some things where you can't just use your specs, you've got to look around those.
Yeah, so
knowing what you're bidding is the best thing for the estimator, having it all on. They mean pricing.
So
enough specialty work that you have it all off and then down in front of you, you can put a price on it. But if you miss something from the start and you never price it, and it shows up later,
Yeah. It's a bust.
It's a bus.
That's what we call it.
That's- But it's mainly in the specs, a lot of
Right.
stuff today.
So, and that's happening across the board, not just with Hunter, but I have to see a lot of the MEP guys, you know, well, it wasn't on the electrical sheets, but it's somewhere else, and it's somewhere else in the landscape drawing, where we got some landscape lighter, or whatever it ends up being. I think, you know, the message there is we gotta be aware of what's happening in all corners of the specification. And to do that, you know, typically we define some processes in our organization to say, here's how we, you know, come through the spec book, and make sure that we're crossing our I's and dotting our T's the same way every time. Not just, here, go read the specs, get the job, kind of to the best of your ability, but are there certain organizational things that we can do that says, this is gonna shield us from risk? So, it also might track some change orders on project, and depending on, you know, level of sophistication and severity of change orders, you guys might be very shrewd at tracking those things and getting paid for it. Depends on who the client is as well. As David, you and I were talking about earlier, you know, somebody else, I'm sorry. You know, depending on, you know, the importance of that client, private client or not, we'll talk about change orders tomorrow afternoon. You know, how hard-nosed are you about change orders and making sure that you know, you're getting paid for everything, but also at the same time, protecting that client relationship. But let's focus on measuring stuff for this session. So at the micro level, job costs and production tracking and feedback. So show of hands, who feels that they've got a good handle on tracking job costs and their production stuff? A couple folks. What kind of things do you guys track with respect to job costs and production?
Every man, how much time he has on each job.
Okay, so there's some accountability down to the lowest common denominator in the organization. The guys putting two things together, saying it's your responsibility to track your time and do it accurately. And we'll talk about what are some, I like that, but there are also some potential areas to get in trouble with you know, tracking things as well. So we'll talk about that. Down to every project figuring out where their time is going. I like that. What else? Anybody else do anything different? Tracking production, you just charge stuff to different jobs based on who's working on what.
Down to the item.
What's that?
Down to the item.
Down to the item or the
If
activity.
you build a stair, you have time on just that stair. If you build a ladder, just that ladder.
Okay. Would you break the stair down even further? To doing
To the
rail?
Well, we separated rails,
Yeah.
stair.
Okay. Yeah, so depends, and depending on your philosophy, again, that idea of diminishing returns, we might say, hey, you know, for us in the business that we're in, if we're just tracking stairs, that's enough for us. And some people, if you're doing, you know, a couple thousand flights of stairs a year as a large organization, you might say, hey, we gotta start tracking each and every little piece of widget that's in this thing, right, to really understand what the costs are.
I do a lot of structural, and my estimator, she'll calculate the weld time, what it takes my employee to actually weld a clip or whatever on a particular beam. She'll calculate over weld time, what it's gonna take to chop down to get that particular task complete.
Awesome. And so then you can tie that stuff back to what you're putting in investment next time around. You know, we also have these things, project dashboard, KPIs, key performance indicators that we'll talk about in the session after this. But, you know, what's happening on the job? What are some big picture items that your project managers should be looking at on the project? What do you guys think?
Job site conditions, job site conditions, like are you working, do you have access to them, you have access to site, are you working in a mud hole with a moat around it or whatever?
Right. So we gotta have a plan in place. Typically, a job site visit is pretty important to get a good, you know, what you just started there. From a metric standpoint, though, what are some of the things your PM should be looking at on a regular basis? Say this is how my project is doing. What's the score on the scoreboard, so to speak?
Just the time that you estimated versus, you know, the time that's actually happening in the shop as you're going along, so it doesn't get out of control. Like maybe they could do it a different way that makes it more efficient.
So budgeted versus actual, and I like what you said is as we're going along, right? So hopefully we're able to monitor progress throughout the project, and some projects or some activities come and go so quickly that, you know, by the time we count everything up, that we've already moved on from that activity, there's no way to impact productivity. There may be an opportunity though to tie it back to the next estimate and say, we blew it. It was only a couple days worth of work, but we blew the budget. So we can tie that information back in. If it's a longer duration activity or item, hopefully we can be monitoring along the way to say, we're 20% of the way into this thing and we're not hitting our productivity marks. What can we do organizationally to support that with more manpower, with more equipment, the right tools, the right amount of resources to get that thing back on track. So those are dashboards, KPIs. A lot of times we'll see project managers, focus in on what are some of the things we can be tracking, like what's the cash flow on this particular project, how are we doing with respect to gross margin gain or fade, what's happening. So high-level items like that, change orders, how much committed cost do we have out to change orders versus the gross profit on our projects. That's a big one as well. At the macro level, though, upstream process, compliance, and behaviors. So we've got a process in an organization that says this is how we're going to do X, Y, and Z. Are folks following that process? What do you guys have processes in your organization? Give me an example of a process. What's a process?
Well, we're in the AIC shop, so we're auditing our process. But we have to follow very specific from the purchase of the material and the mill search and tracking all the material to the job and actually separating material for the specific job.
Okay.
All the way through each station of operation. Through the welding and through the coating, which is separate, counting all by itself for painting and coating.
Right.
And then the direction installation is on separate. So we track
Each of them, basically, things. So upstream, behavioral compliance to say, if we're tracking all that, then the downstream, the end product should be, that's why we have the process in place, right? To make sure that we're doing it right and that we've got a high standard of quality. Same thing with, take for example, pre-job planning. If we as an organization say there's a certain set of things that we're going to do before we start a job, and that's our process, like maybe we've got a process that says we're going to go do a site visit prior to sending guys out in the field to start work before we get a whole bunch of guys out there and either the area is not ready for them or the conditions are unworkable or whatever it may be. We're going to do a site visit prior to going out there. We're going to sit down with the foreman or the field leadership and share the budget with them and help them understand what the expectations for the project are. We're going to build a short interval plan. We're going to come up with, a few of these key components. If that's our process in the organization, do we have compliance with it? Meaning, do we do it every single time? Or these are just kind of general, good practices that we would like to do if you got time, kind of thing. When do we ever have time in this industry? Hardly ever, right? There's always some fire that needs to be put out or something that we need to rush to. That subverts a lot of good practices. So upstream compliance measurements, whether you've got processes in place to track that kind of stuff, that allows an organization to say, hey, are we doing this stuff right or are we doing it wrong? And usually it's pretty binary, it's pretty simple to track. We started 5 projects last month and we successfully went through our planning process on 4 of them. We're at 80% compliance. But those type of metrics help at least folks at the high level of the organization get an understanding of how are we doing it running this business. Or was it just a bunch of single individuals going out and kind of doing their own thing? Upstream, are we doing them consistently? Are we right behaviors? Downstream, what are the results? What's coming out of the back end? So we had a survey that was done. This was a 2013 survey of business owners in the construction space. Do you have project managers or project, what we jokingly sometimes refer to as the project witness. Can you see the project witness? You might shake your head, you may have project witnesses in your organization. There's a difference between project manager or project leader and a project witness. Project witness is the guy that can document everything and tell you what's happening on the project. We're not really leading or managing anything different. So Project minutes get up, yeah, I could have told you that that was the wrong subcontractor hire. I could have told you working with that owner wasn't going to be a good idea. The project witness, or we were just witnessing things going by, happening to us, and then projects managing us instead of us managing the project. We're going to have project managers actually managing and leading change on the job. I think it's a pretty distinct difference, and intuitively you guys can feel that within your own organization when you see it in certain circumstances. But we did a survey and said, do your field managers know where they are compared to the estimated cost for targeted production rates, at least on a weekly basis? And so these were the results. Yes, half the folks said, yeah, our guys are tracking that stuff. I know what's happening on our project. But then again, 40% of them said, some of them do. And 11% said flat out, no, we're not tracking them. They don't know. And my pushback on the fact that some of them do means that, some of your guys are going to manage all of your projects at one point. You got kind of a pool of project managers, and some of them are monitoring stuff and some of them aren't. Eventually they're going to be on a significant project, and if we're not monitoring these things, it could expose the organization to some pretty significant risk. I was with a contractor 2 weeks ago, actually, in Indianapolis, and these guys do $60 million worth of annual revenue in the mechanical space, and they had no types of tracking whatsoever. They actually had a failed implementation of the software to help them track all this stuff. And so project managers just running completely blind on costs. And so, you can imagine how stressful that is for folks to be running large, major, multi-million-dollar projects without having any idea of where they are on their jobs. And some people have that in different degrees. Some people have really sophisticated software platforms that can tell you up to the minute how your project's doing. But for most people, some type of weekly reporting cadence is enough for us to say, are we winning or are we losing on this project? And at a week, at a max, I think would be appropriate. If you wait, projects that you have, if we're waiting more than a week to find out where we are on the job, a lot of times, that opportunity has either expired or left us because we're already moving on to other activities when we can't affect what's happening in the field. Job cost system basic requirements. Everything starts with a good budget. So, is a budget the same thing as an estimate? What do you guys think? Budget and estimate the same?
Yeah.
So there's arguments. It depends on how you estimate it, I guess, would be a question. A lot of folks will say that depending on how our organization is set up and how we estimate things, that the way in which we estimate work is not necessarily the way in which we think about how we're going to go install. So you might estimate certain components on aggregate or off of linear feet or off of square footage or certain components like that, but the actual construction of it happens in a much more detailed fashion. And so maybe your estimate is already broken down and translating the budget is pretty much a straightforward process. But a lot of times our folks in the field have a little bit different notion on how things should go together and where our hours should be attributed, folks in the field and or the fab shop. They have a little bit more hands-on approach and understanding what it takes to accomplish certain tasks that's not always in the minds of our estimating staffs. So depending on how you're structured, some people have estimators that are project managers, kind of dual roles. Some people have guys that are fabricators that are estimators that kind of do it all from cradle to grave. But I would urge you guys to think about getting at least some fabrication or field eyes onto a budget before you start execution. Did anybody do that currently? So a couple of folks in the room. Bruce, tell me about getting the field involved and looking at the budget before we go out there and send and mobilize on the job.
Well, number one, you have to have really good lead guys and you gotta have good foreman. But when we do it,
Right.
on a complex job, we actually let the estimator sit down and we get feedback on certain connection details and certain non-standard fabrication techniques. We'll sit down and we'll ask about how long it will take to do this connection. And then rather than just plugging the number on the computer, we got a little better data. And then once it becomes a job, then we pull them all together again.
Right.
And we do a plan way before we even purchase material and go to the field. We sit down with the team and do another hash meeting.
Great. Best scenario is that we've got field guys involved in the estimate, in talking about it. Especially this is a high-profile strategic pursuit where we know we need to really be sharp on it. We've got to get that type of accuracy and involvement. It's challenging though to get guys in to work on an estimate, isn't it? Sometimes, right? When you guys got, you guys just got people sitting around waiting to help in and jump in on an estimating meeting, right? So there's a push and pull. You got to set, as I imagine, you have set organizational priorities to say, you know, the risks are there and significant enough that we've got to make time to do it. You know, we can't afford not to have those guys help us out on the estimating side of things. A lot of times though, let's say you don't have any type of field expertise involved in the estimate. We come up with an estimate and we're fairly close, we think. But that next step of once it becomes a job, once we've won it, bringing guys in and help them vet that estimate and say, you know, we've got hours allocated by different activities based on what the estimating staff came up with. Maybe a field guy looks at that and said, well, you're really thin on hours over here and you're fat on hours over here. If we're going to track it like this, and we know that, could we level that playing field a little bit and move hours around? Does that happen at all in the beginning of the project for you guys? And recasting budgets, to recast the hours?
Yeah. Well, you find out sometimes you have to finish something in the field that you were planning on doing in the shop.
Okay, yeah. Or you subcontract something?
You transfer hours.
Track those out.
Transfer hours
Right.
before the job starts.
Before, sometimes you don't find
In
out.
some cases,
Okay.
yeah.
We're going there here in a second because a lot of times if we don't transfer hours, we don't have that kind of meeting of the minds and begin the project and get guys together and say, hey, do we all agree that this is realistic? And then we start tracking things. If people don't agree that that's an appropriate allocation of hours across activities, our guys who are responsible for reporting themselves kind of and saying, here's what I worked on, if we're sharing labor budgets with them and saying, hey, you're running over on this, when it wasn't a realistic budget to begin with, you get all kinds of wacky behaviors when we start sprinkling hours into different cost codes and allocating hours to different jobs, different activities, simply because we don't want to make it look like we're blowing a budget and the budget wasn't realistic.
Right. There are certain situations that may change and kind of forces your hand to shift hours. Something's changed, it's going to have to roll in now, as opposed to it being done in the shop, we're transferring it to the field.
Right.
So we'll deduct and shift them over.
Yeah, and your assumptions, your productivity assumptions will change as soon as you do that. Right. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit more about budget here in a section, but reporting of installed units and quantities and associated hours where practical. So if we're able to, in certain tasks, it's a little bit more difficult. We're able to tracking things from a quantity basis in a best-in-class way to calculate our productivity. And later on in the section, we'll talk about why that is in this concept of earned value. Solid change order management. So depending on what your practice is in your organization, sometimes you get a change order and just say, let's lump that in with everything else. And it grows our hours and our materials based on our original budget. Some people will track that separately as almost an individual project. I don't think there's any right or wrong there, but being very judicious about updating budgets there is extremely important. I can't tell you how many organizations I see that all of a sudden have additional costs and revenue at the back end of a project and never have any updated budgets in between. And so, while it may be small in nature, but that type of behavior or lack of control can quickly become a large change order, and all of a sudden we don't know whether we're making money or losing money on change orders or not. User-friendly report formats. So getting information back to the field and getting information back to estimating, more user-friendly and easier it is to understand and read. Obviously, the more efficiently folks will be able to interpret that information, and the better they'll be able to use it. A lot of times we go to accounting and say, print out this data or this job cost report. It's like, you know, it's on 11 by 17 and it's, you know, size 10 font and it's this long, and you're going through with a highlighter trying to figure out what happened. It's easier if we're able to produce reports that show us a summary real quick of here's what happened on the job on these activities, and it ran over, it ran under, it was profitable, it wasn't profitable. User-friendly report formats are great. Some folks in here might have automation in that arena for your business if you got a particular software platform that allows you to do that. And some folks say, well, we're just simply tracking it on an Excel database. Perfect. Perfect, but to have some way of boiling down and condensing it so we can have productive conversation around data other than combing through, you know, lines of spreadsheets to try to find answers, it's not usually an efficient way to use people's time. And then sharing information with the entire team. And by the team, I mean down to the foreman level of the organization, the people who are running the work. And that's not always the case, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong. You know, 95% or more of the construction space is privately held. And so people will often play their cards close to the vest and say, hey, this stuff is, this cost stuff, this profit stuff, that's proprietary information. And we're just not going to willy-nilly share that with anybody and everybody in the company. How many of you guys share job cost information at the job level? Why is that?
I have an incentive program.
Okay.
More everybody to own it, more everybody to be involved.
Right.
Realize what we're trying to do.
So I think ownership is a key there, right? So if we want people to, I always kind of use, you know, the sentiment that if we want people to manage something, you know, back to that first slide we talked about, if we want people to manage it, we got to show them that be able to measure it. You know, we got to give them some sense of what the score on the scoreboard is. I can't tell you how many organizations I see that, you know, they verbally, not physically, but they verbally beat up their foreman because we're running over on man hours, yet the foreman does not get to see the budgeted or actual man hours. So it's, you know, it's a lot like the project manager sits back, you know, holding his cards like this and says, yeah, well, we're actually way behind schedule. We need you guys to pick things up. And so that's the only type of feedback that folks in the field have to say, well, I guess we're behind, we've got to work harder. And it seems like we're always behind too, right? Seems like we're always running over on budget. So sharing information with the entire team, and I really think, at least at the foreman level, you know, hours is probably the most important thing to share, right? Because typically a foreman is not deciding what the wage blend is on his project or what they're working on. That is somebody else, the general superintendent or our VP ops is coordinating the manpower. And so costs are not always within their purview, but hours definitely are. How do we manage hours and what's happening on the project? So a good budget establishes the baseline. And I like to think about it in terms of golf. So, you know, if this is a par 5, which, you know, that should be the expectation for this particular hole. Just like if you guys set up a budget that has 100 hours for specific activity, that should be the expectation for that activity, right? And if it's not realistic, if it's really 150 hours, right? Then, you know, what should the expectation be? So, in other words, if it's really a par 5, what we're saying you should get it done in a par 4. Is that fair to be placing that onto our field plan? Just because we bid it wrong and now we need to make up hours, we're going to say, hey, this is really the expectation of the project. Should we not adjust those things on the front end? There's an argument to be made for that. A logical work breakdown structure. So, you know, more than just the way that we estimated it, but do we get a good set of field eyes on it and say, hey, is this appropriate? Can we move some dollars or some hours around to where you feel more comfortable with it? And if people are able to see that on the front end of a project and able to take a look at those those costs or those hours that we have, we can get that ownership and that buy-in. I like to call it getting your fingerprints on the murder weapon, so to speak. So if our guys in the field, if all they do is they get a budget kind of lobbed over the fence from our estimator or project management staff and says, here's what we came up with, we bid it, and here, you guys take this out in the field and go execute it. It's right, I know there's enough hours in there because I did it myself. You guys go ahead and go do it. Without that type of buy-in on the front end, you know, what kind of ownership or buy-in does somebody have if a certain activity or if the job starts getting decided with respect to hours? What do guys in the field say at that point if we're running behind? When you start blowing labor budgets in the field, what do the field guys say? Yeah, you estimated screwed up. You must have figured it wrong, you must have bid it wrong. I certainly never got to take a look at it, so I'm gonna start pointing the finger back at the office. Right? But if we're able to bring a guy in on the front end, this pre-job planning piece, and we're able to sit down and get consensus on, yeah, we're tight here, but it's probably doable. You got a little bit of fat here, maybe we move some hours into a different area. And you're able to get people's buy-in and say, everyone nod their head in agreements. And some organizations even have a form that signs off on the budget with a superintendent, a foreman, and a project manager who says, everyone's seen this and looked at it, we all agree that this is doable. Now you've got people in the field that say, you know, I understand how much is in this. And now I got a little more sense of accountability that I can go, you know, get this done. If I'm not privy to that on the front end, that's just somebody else's problem that they didn't bid it right or didn't, you know, put enough hours in. So a little bit more ownership when we get a chance to look at on the front end. You know, track estimated quantities were practical. Sometimes you can't track them. It should involve collaboration with the field manager for sure. And I would say, you know, when we talk about tracking different activities, I would say limit any given activity to, you know, 5 to 7% of the total budget. How many different activities might you track on a project? 8? 5 to 8, okay. Anybody higher than that?
Depends on what it is.
Yeah, okay, it all depends on what it is. But how many different like widgets or different components are there on a given project? Could be hundreds, right? Thousands, right? And so some organizations, again, this is that diminishing returns thing. Some organizations say, hey, we want to track everything, you know, down to the gnat's ass on what we're trying to track, right? And we'll say, we got 1,000 different items. And then then we send out a time card into the field that's this long. And guys have got to track what they did on a daily basis by 50 different codes. And people start saying, gosh, make me do all this paperwork. You know, I'm a foreman, I'm a welder. You know, this is not what you hired me to do. And it's sucking my productivity because I've got to spend an hour just trying to figure out this complex spreadsheet. So I think there's a happy medium there too, though, right? Because if we just said it's all one big bucket of hours, and we could know we're meeting our labor budgets or we're overrunning labor budgets, but it wouldn't give us a whole lot more information other than that, right? Other than that was a successful job or a bad job. We couldn't peel back the layers of the onion and say, well, we lost some hours fabbing this part of it. But once we got in the field, we were able to make it up in the install. That type of intelligence comes from the breakdown, and typically somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to a dozen codes. It is probably pretty appropriate depending on the complexity of the project. But anytime you start getting into way too many codes, number one, it's a burden onto the people that got to track it. Number two, it's a lot more difficult to process that type of information. And if it's a burden on people who are tracking it, people will ultimately get lazy. So if you're working an 8-hour day and I'm asking you to track 15 different things, I mean, how detailed am I really going to be? I'm going to say 20 minutes there, 20 minutes there, and just kind of sprinkle hours across, cost codes, just because it's way too much to reasonably track. I say you should limit it to 5%. So 5%, which if everyone was the same, would be 20 different activities, right? So that would be the, on the real high side of, now, accounting-wise, you might have different costs that roll up into those activities, and that's perfectly okay for our county to concern themselves with that and spend their time around that. But I'm really focused on folks that have to track this stuff in the field. If we ask them to think about, more than 20 cost scopes for the life of a project, and really if they're thinking about more than 3 or 4 on a daily basis, we start to lose some integrity around the data. And we'll talk about that here in a second about, what could possibly happen there. So, reporting both quantities and associated hours, why is it important? So, let's talk about percent complete. Our estimated labor up here on the top box, we put $10,000 in the job, and we've actually spent $5,000. Variance of 5,000 hours, what's left? What's the projected labor to finish the project? So you would hope it's $5,000, right? But do we really know?
Well, depends on if you've got half of it.
Let's change the equation. So percent complete of a project, you guys all calculate percent complete on a job, right? For the most part. Now, the small stuff, it might not be a percent complete calculation. But let's say we've got a budget, an actual or spent. If we had a budget of $100 and we've actually spent $50, what percent complete are we? You would hope we're 50% complete, right? Right? Because the budget was 100, we've spent 50, so whoa, we better be 50% complete, but we don't really know, right? This type of information is a good rough indicator on where we should be, but it doesn't tell you where you're actually at. So, for example, if this is the sole way in which folks calculate percent complete, and I see it a lot with my clients, is if all we do is calculate it based on dollars, I see a lot of projects that end up at 125% complete. It's hard to do, right? If we did 25% more work, actually we just spent 25% more on the project than we thought we were going to. And so percent complete based on just dollars, it's a good rough indicator, but it doesn't really give us a whole lot of great information when it talks to where are we on the project as far as the performance standpoint. So how is this job performing? What is the projected labor? So this one is actually incorporating units. So we had 100 units on the project. We installed 25 units. Estimated labor was $10,000. Actual labor was $5,000. What's the projected labor on this project? You would just say mathematically 20,000, right? Because we're getting half of what we thought if this was accurate, we would have only spent $2,500, right? Because we've only done 25% of the work. Put another way, if you had 100 hours and you spent 50 hours, spell freeze out. What percent complete are you there? You would hope 50% complete, right? So we've spent half of our labor budgeted hours. We would hope we're 50%, but you still don't really know. Units is really what makes all this tracking thing work. So if we bid 100 units and we install 50 units, now what percent complete are you? 50. Now, you could say the first 50 units that we did were the easy ones. Maybe it's the first floor, we're going to go to the second floor. Second 50 units are going to be harder. Or you could say, if you tied labor back to units, you could say we were less productive at the start because we had some layout things to do. We were moving some things around. We were just starting up and mobilizing. So there's always a learning curve and a mobilization piece there. But this whole idea of tracking units, if we don't track units, all we're doing is tracking hours. It's really difficult for us to tell what's happening from a productivity standpoint on a project. What's the definition of productivity. Mathematically, that's important. So there's this thing called production. What's that? What's production? You say how much production you get done. It's how much work you're getting completed, right? And so some people might say that this is units of output. That's our production. You can track it. Linear feet, square footage, pounds, whatever the output is, you can track that and say, that's how much we got done today. That was our production for the day. But what was your productivity for the day? So our productivity is really our units of output divided by units of input. That's productivity, right? So you could say linear feet per man hour, depending on what business you're in, cubic yards per minute hour. But you can track, that's really how we calculate productivity. It's units of output per units of input. You could say, inches of weld per hour, right? That would be a unit of productivity because an output is something you can track against what's going into it. And some people flip that on its edge and say hours per linear foot or hours per inch of weld. Some people usually refer to that more as an efficiency measure. It's really the same math, it's just reversed. Right? But tracking things by units is important, and we'll talk about a measure on how to portray this concept of earned value. Before we go there, though, let's use another example of how things can go wrong in tracking job costs. So this is why accurate field reporting is important. We said if we got too many cost codes, people might do some funny stuff with the information and might just start sprinkling it wherever they feel. Why else might someone be faulty reporting information in the field?
Overtime.
Okay. Overtime meaning that we're less productive so we can get overtime. Okay. There is an argument made for that. How many of you guys have ever knowingly and purposely coded an hour of time to a code that wasn't where that hour was spent on an activity? Raise your hand. Okay. The rest of you guys are lying. So I know it happens all the time. It happens all the time. You say, boy, we're really out of budget here. We're going to throw it over there. And there's a couple reasons why that is. We'll talk about here in a second. But it happens, and I want to show you guys the effect of if we have that behavior, and if that behavior in an organization grows to kind of an uncontrollable scale. And some of the effects we have on estimating. So our estimated hours, let's take a look at job number 1. Activity A and activity B, we had 100 hours estimated for each of those activities, and then actually spent on the job. This is the job done and completed. We actually spent 90 hours on activity A, and we spent 110 hours in activity B. And so a lot of organizations will say, oh yeah, we lost some money here, picked up some money here. At the end of the day, it was a pretty good estimate. Because the estimate was 200, and that's what we brought in at. But there's components of that estimate that weren't exactly accurate, were they? So what actually happened in the field is there's a gentleman out there that was counting this stuff and said, well, I ran up to my 100 hours on activity B, and when I got to activity A, I said, I've got 10 extra hours on activity B. And just to smooth things out and make all the math work, put 10 hours up in activity A so that we don't overrun activity B. feasible scenario, right? You can see this happening in the field with someone looking at a budget saying, well, put $10 over in A. So look, so this is what the estimator got back. Exactly the same amount of hours. The estimator is saying what? That's a pretty good estimate, huh, guys? You like that estimate, right? Right, dead accurate. And so then the estimator says, wow, I really nailed that last project. Job number 2 comes up, and the estimator goes to submit the job, and he's got proportionally a different amount of activity B, but he uses the same labor factors that he used on the last job. He says, well, I know how much it costs us to do, so I'm going to put 1,000 hours of activity B. I'm going to use 100 hours a day. What actually ended up happening on the job was productivity didn't change, right? The same amount of time it took them to execute on the last job, same amount of time it took them to do it on this job, except on this project, they bought a whole lot more of activity B, and they bit off a whole lot more risk that they didn't understand. So what ended up happening is they overran by 100 hours in activity B. They tried to fill up activity A to 100, but then that one was capped out too. And it ended up blowing the total labor budget by 90 hours. Plausible scenario, right? So if we're not really judicious and accurate in the way in which we're reporting, and we're expecting estimators to say, here's our cost on these last projects that we did, take this information and apply it to future work. If that information is not accurate, you can get these results immediately, and you can get the organization in a world of trouble. So why would folks not report exactly what's happening in the field?
Cover your ass.
What's that?
Cover your ass.
CYA, right? Is that what you're gonna say, man?
I was just going to say, they just don't want to bother with it, so they just kind of make it up.
Okay, so
You're asking too much.
right, so some folks don't have buy-in, and they say, you know what? You don't pay me to do paperwork. You don't pay me to track stuff. You pay me to install work, or you pay me to be a foreman. So that's what I'm going to do. And yeah, because you're really trying to jam this down my throat, and you made a whole bunch of noise about it, I'll sing and dance for you, and I'll fill this thing out, but it's not going to be accurate. Okay. The other argument is it's CYA, right? It's, hey, every time my manager sees a labor report and we're running over on a particular cost code, he comes down to the job site to tell me what for, and to really, get a hold of me and get on my case. And so if you've got to take a beating every time a job cost report comes out or a time a labor report comes out, guys will quickly start to figure out and say, hey, I could slide some hours around. Now, what's going to happen at the end of the project if we move hours around? It all boils to the surface at the end of the day, right? So dollars spent here or there, it doesn't matter if we try and smooth it during the project. It all boils to the surface at the end. But what folks say is, hey, I'd rather take one meeting at the end of the job than a weekly meeting of things that are running over. And that's really a philosophy that exists in a lot of organizations, because folks will see labor budgets running over and react not in the best of ways. They get on the guys in the field and say, you guys are running behind, you're screwing things up, you're doing all this stuff. When really we should be trying to figure out how do we solve this and using it as a vehicle for communication. So if you knew that you were running over, you could actually get the right people involved and have the right conversations on how to solve it. And you could have the right conversations understanding what data is real and what's not. Now, this happens when we only track by hours. If we're tracking units alongside it, there's a way to quickly dispel a lot of that kind of fuzzy data or people that might be misrepresenting what's happening in the field. And we'll talk about here in a second. It's really this concept of earned value, which is what I'll call the gold standard in the construction industry for how to track productivity. It's the number one way in which folks represent data and really showcase to their guys in the field what the score on the scoreboard is. And I keep using that term, score on the scoreboard. It'd be without having information presented to the field on what the budget is and and where you're at, even in terms of hours and units. Without that information, it'd be a lot like playing an entire game of basketball and then turning the score on at the end of the score, at the end of the game, and saying, oh, well, you guys lost by 2, right? And I think that's a lot the way that our guys feel sometimes in the field, is if we ask them to go execute an entire job, and the only type of feedback or information they get is at the end of the job when we say, hey guys, we blew the budget by 10%. Good effort, but wasn't quite enough. Because nobody knew what was happening throughout. Same thing, like, you know, if you knew what the score was during a basketball game, which you obviously do every time, you play according to what the situation is. Right? You allocate resources, you sit guys on the bench if they're in foul trouble. Same thing with a construction project. You support that project in different ways and with different resources, especially in input from project managers, and senior managers on how to affect the productivity of that particular activity or project. And it's the same thing, your game plan is going to be different for 3rd and 15 than it is going to be for 3rd and 2. Right? You're going to call different plays, you're going to do different things. Same thing on a project. So the earned value is industry standard, practical way to provide feedback. It's a single productivity metric. You can break it down by activity, by project. You can track it by individual PM, superintendent. You can take a look at the division, the company, slice and dice it a whole bunch of different ways. But it adds this word right here, objectivity, to the equation. That allows us to say this is what really happened and this is what actually happened on the project. A lot of times, you guys ever do like a post-job review, post-job meeting, and kind of sit back and say, did we win or we lose on the last job, and how to get better? A lot of times in those meetings, there's a lot of finger pointing on what went wrong on the project. But if we look specifically at these numbers, we can tell what happened on the job. And we can tell that because we've got, one, we're tracking units, not just hours and dollars. What do we need in order to create earned value measurement? So we definitely need, from the start, we need a great budget, estimated units or quantities for key items in the budget, and estimated man hours for each item. So 2 things we got to have, units and man hours. And it's got to be accurate and qualified by a field eye, meaning a superintendent, a foreman, an ex-foreman that's now moved in the office, somebody that knows what they're talking about, other than just, you know, coming up with a spreadsheet, has looked at this and said, that makes sense. And from the field, during the project, we got to record installed units or quantities, percent completes for items that we might not be able to track unit-wise. So some of those more unique items, can we come up with a general gut feel, kind of looking at it, can we come up with a percent complete, even if we're not allowed to able to track units? And then actual man hours for each item in the budget. So here's some math up here, and all that back, folks, you can't see it that well. But we'll run through a couple different scenarios here. This is an example of how you would go about tracking this stuff on the project. So let's take a look at our first activity up here, activity A. In our budget, we said we've got 1,000 linear feet, and we agreed between the estimated and operational staffs that it would take us 800 man hours to install 1,000 linear feet of whatever activity A is. Here, on the right side of this black bar, is the actual. So the units associated here in actual are, we've actually installed 300 units. So if you've actually installed 300 units out of 1,000, where would you be at percent complete wise? 30%, right? You'd feel pretty confident. You might say, you know, if you had a conversation with the field manager, you might say, you know, the first 30 were easy or the first 30 were difficult. So you could judge based on that whether you were actually 30% complete. But let's say this mathematically we're 30% complete with what we contractually agreed to. Now comes in the factor of this earned piece. So another client of mine calls it what it should be in the budget. And that's really what the mathematical translation we're making here is. So if we've installed 30% of the units, what percent of the hours should we have used? 30%, right? So it's just a translation into hours of percent complete. So this says you know, the budget was 800 hours. We should have used 30% of them based on how far we are. So we really have earned 240 hours. 30% of the budget, 30% of the units. 240 hours is what we earned. Now we say, what did we actually spend on the job today? And that actual hours is 275. So we've actually spent more than we've technically earned on this activity yet. And depending on how you want to look at it, this particular spreadsheet applies a ratio to it. It says we're actually at 87% of the productivity that was budgeted. Meaning we're underrunning, or we're overrunning our hours, and we're not executing at the productivity level we thought we were. And then this piece, projected hours. What are the projected hours that are left? 917 hours projected left. Well, you can already tell that you're going to run over 1,000 hours in it, but that projected hours is calculated by applying the productivity to date in the project extrapolated across the rest of the remaining units. Let's take a look at another one here, just for example purposes. What about activity B? 5,000 units, 5,000 square feet, and we said 1,500 hours to install that work. Today, we've done 50%, 2,500 units. The earned hours is 50% of the hours that we had in the budget, 750. The actual hours is only 675. So we're actually more productive on this particular item than we thought we were going to be. And that shows up in green. And then our projected hours, 1,350, actually are going to underrun this. I'm sorry. So the first one I said 917. 917 is the projected final hours, which is more than the 800 hours that we're at. And the same with activity B, 1,350 hours is less than the 1,500 that we had originally calculated. Now, if you jump down, C is very similar. You can look at that one, the way it's calculated, the same math. Jump down to D, we have 1 unit. Can you think of something where you might have just, you want to be able to track it by units? Something where you couldn't take a quantifiable linear feet or...
A fireplace.
What's that?
A fireplace.
Okay. Or some one specific activity that you said you can't really track it by a particular unit. You a lump sum number for that, right? In terms of hours, it's going to take us whatever, 200 hours, whatever it ends up being, is this whole bucket of hours. And so for this activity D, that's your fireplace. 150 hours to install it or fab it or whatever. 150 hours, can't really track the progress on it because it's kind of one big thing. So we rely on folks in the field to tell the office how far along we are with that. So they say, hey, we're 80% complete with this based on, because I've done 1,000 of them before and I know how far along we are, And so we're 80% complete of the way, and we've got to have that trust with our folks in the field to be able to tell us that accurately. But for a lump sum number like that, we can say we're 80% complete. And then we could say we've spent 80% of the hours, so we're actually right on track. And then you could sum all this up in terms of earned versus actual and get that whole job number. So 106% of productivity for the job. You can pull a whole bunch of jobs together and say, this is where we're at for the organization. Pulling it together. So you can roll up those earned value numbers and say, how productive are we being overall? Now, earlier we talked about this concept of easily reporting information, making user-friendly reports. And I'm going to showcase this example of a user-friendly report. And why we think this is probably one of the easiest ways to represent productivity data. What we've got going on here is the data up here in the upper left-hand corner is the budget. This is all represented in hours based on similar math that we did on the previous page. So the budgeted hours that we have, and these things over here, cost codes, or you guys might call them phase codes or activity codes. But they're codes, and there's budget hours for each. There's what we've used on each of them, and there's what we've earned on each of them. Okay? And all this does is forecast this into easily identifiable bar graphs that says, here's what's happening by activity. So I think sometimes, take this spreadsheet and multiply it by 10, sometimes I think we go out to the job site with this huge giant spreadsheet and say, hey, don't you understand that we're running over on, you know, column K, row 39, that's the number you need to be focused on. Translating it into an easily digestible report like this, I like to use what they call the 15-second rule. If you take a look at it in 15 seconds and understand it, it's probably a pretty good tool. If it takes longer than that, guys are spending too much time trying to interpret the data. Having a graph like this, easily, you know, obviously we've got to train people on how to read it, but it's easily something you can look at it very quickly on Monday morning and know exactly what's happening on that project with respect to productivity. So let's talk about it. The blue is the budget. So the blue represents our budget of labor hours. If I'm a foreman and I get this information, whatever day of the week it is, I'm looking at a Monday morning, my eye immediately gravitates towards the blue bars, right? The tallest blue bars. And the height of the blue bar basically tells me how much risk is in that particular activity, right? So obviously the taller the bar, the more labor hours we have associated with that activity. Those are the big focal points of the project, right? Where we have the most hours. Have some, you know, some smaller items might be small in hours, but still high risk. But typically, if we say we get the top 5 to 6 buckets of hours, if we're productive on the main activities for the job, pretty much everything else will follow along with it. If we're really productive on the main course of activities. So our bars here showcase the different size buckets of hours. Our red is showing how much we've used, and our green showing how much we've earned. So if you were going to get this report, and you're the foreman in the field, and you're looking at cost code 4100 in the bottom left, what's your reaction to that? What are you thinking when you see 4100? It's over, but it's small, right? So out of whatever that is, 3,700 hours, 3,741 hours, out of all of that, we're only over by maybe 100 hours or so. And so what you might say is, hey, we're running over, and you might have a conversation, PM to foreman, hey, we're running over here. What's the situation? The foreman might say, yeah, we ran behind because we had to do some layout on the front end today, up some hours, but now we're starting balling to go with straightaway work. We're going to make that up. Okay. And you got to have that level of trust with folks on either side of that conversation. But you can get a sense that things are not disastrous there, but we got some opportunity to make it up. The biggest thing I see about 4100 is we're only about halfway through. So we got a lot of runway to fix that. What's happening with 4500? What's happening? What do you guys think? You got a problem there. Yeah. That's an eyebrow raiser. I mean, you're at, you know, just eyeballing it. It says you're getting 50% of the productivity that you thought you were going to get on, right? You're only half earned what you thought, or what you've used. So yeah, you've got a problem. I heard bust over here. Yeah, maybe it's a bust. Maybe it's something that we either didn't catch or didn't qualify in that pre-job planning process where we sat down and looked at the budget. Or we got into it and we didn't understand the specifications the way we thought they were written or the way we interpreted them. And now the change in the spec is causing us to do our work differently or execute it differently. And so we've lost some productivity, or haven't lost productivity. We're just doing the scope of work in a different fashion. What's happened here in 5200? That's an interesting one. You saw that. What questions might you start to ask? So you've got a budget. You've used some hours, but you haven't completed anything. There could be a few different things going on, right? So one, this could be layout. Yeah, so we were laying out, we haven't done anything. What else could that be saying?
Fix my mistake.
Huh? Yeah, or it might say, that might be a red flag to say guys are throwing hours in cost codes that we're not even working on yet, right? We've overran somewhere else, and to hide hours, we're putting them in activity where we haven't tracked any units. And so all we're doing is we've got actuals against budget, but no earn. That's potential there. Or you could say maybe this is maybe that's one of those lump sum deals where you're not going to see, the percent complete is going to be based on guys' gut feel, and we may have charged hours to it yet, but we don't have an idea of what percent complete we are. Let's take a look at 6,200. What happened there? So 6,200, we blew the budget, and the cost code is dead, right? Because as soon as we've earned what's in the budget, that code is complete. And so we've blown the budget, and it's complete, and there ain't nothing we can do about it now, right? If you look back here at 4,500, you're saying, wow, we've got a problem, but still got a lot of opportunity to mitigate that loss or to get it back on track. If you look at 6,200, that one's dead and gone. Lost money on it. And so I've got a client that calls this report the bird report because 6,200 is giving you the bird. So when you get a 6,200 on this report, it's called the bird. It flips you the bird and says you screwed up on that particular code. Also, I've got another client that calls 5,500. When 5,500 is complete on that track, they call it a touchdown report. So if our earned and our bud meets our budget and we spent less than that, it ends up we get a touchdown report. But anyways, it's a quick way for you to be able to look and see what's happening. Percent complete translated into hours based on where you're at on the problem. Let you know immediately where you're at, looking through these cost codes to be able to understand exactly what's happening. And typically, this is probably about as many codes as you would want to put on there. And even dead codes like this, or an expired code where we've already completed the work, there's not a whole lot of value having that on the report anymore, is there? Once it's over and done with, we can slide that off and just focus on the active ones, right? What's happening today on the project? Where can we focus our efforts? This is pretty rear view mirror. Now, we'll definitely want to pull that out and dust it off at the end of the job when we go to review it. But to actively continue to look at it, it's really just taking up space on the page. So, let's take a few seconds to dive into a bit of a review here. But some best practices around, collecting this data. One, I think, is education. Helping folks understand in the field. If you're going to ask guys to go track this kind of stuff and report it accurately, helping them understand what you're trying to do with that data. A lot of times I think we just, send out a time card and say, here, track your hours against all these different activities and reporting units because I said so, kind of thing. Because you work here and to get paid, you got to fill out your time card that way. If we're able to communicate the value that we've talked about here today of having accurate data tied back to estimating, would that make a difference in the way in which they approach how they're allocating time? Some people, you might say, no, they still wouldn't care. Okay, I mean, you're going to have some folks that just don't care in your organization, but we want to make it perfectly clear to people to say this is important. There are risks if we get this stuff wrong. We've got to be able to track it. Why? I mean, why are we trying to track this stuff accurately?
You can measure it.
So you measure it, yeah, but so, I mean, hopefully we're getting good information back into estimating, so one, we don't end up with this happening on our projects, with big estimating busts happening based on historical information. If we've got estimating busts happening on our project based on historical information, and we do that enough times, you can quickly get a business into some serious trouble. And also, so if we got accurate data, we can be sharp going forward. We can win more projects, get more project opportunities for our foremen and for our crews to go out and execute work. So it's really, when you boil it down, folks being able to contribute to the organization's information based on populating time cards and recording quantities in the field is really, building and furthering a future for themselves themselves in the organization as far as the get work process happens on the back end of that. Implementation is tough. And so typically, the way that we help companies work on this stuff is just say, you're gonna have guys in your organization that are the old crusty superintendents that just say, hey, I'm not gonna do that. It's not my thing. You can have somebody else track that data, but that's not what I do. It's not what you pay me to do, so I'm not gonna get along, I'm gonna get along and do it. Well, there's folks out there that say that. One of the best ways to combat that is to get people bought into the process and have it become their idea. And so you can get people bought in by saying, hey, we want to understand how we're actively executing the field. We got to be able to tie that back to estimating. Get a team of folks, young folks, senior folks from different parts of the organization, say collectively between, the 6 people that you gather in a room, you got over 100 years of construction experience in that room. What's the one best way to do that for our organization? What's the right amount of cost code? Is it 5? Is it 10? I don't know. But for the type of work that y'all do, get a couple different people thinking about that, especially senior field leadership. And if they say, hey, I contributed to developing this process, and the president, the CEO, or the CFO, or controller, and the senior management of the organization actually listened to what the field was saying, and we had to say in the number of codes that we were going to track to make it, less burdensome on them, but also efficient for us to track as an organization. We can get that type of buy-in. The implementation typically runs much smoother. And implementation doesn't happen overnight. You can't just flip the switch and say, everyone start tracking everything tomorrow because it's a good idea. It takes a long time to get that right. Typically start out with, if you want to, maybe you are tracking stuff right now, but you want to break it down a little bit further. Maybe if you're tracking 1 or 2 codes, you say, I want to go to 8 codes, beta test it a little bit. Take it out to one project and say, let's do a practice goal swing with this. And let's try it out on one job and track it a little bit more deeply. Now, if that works and we like the results that we get and we like the fact that we have that added information, let's continue to do it and roll it out on more projects. But it's always best to kind of dip your toe in the water first before we say we're going to make sweeping changes to the way in which we track information. Right? So implementation, slow implementation with lots of buy-in, and then we got to be able to track compliance. Are we doing it right or are we doing it not? Kind of thing. And then troubleshooting, any type of implementation with tracking data in your organization is going to be an evolutionary process, and it's going to be constantly changing. So just to say that you guys had a meeting one time to decide what you guys are going to track, and we kind of put a pin in that. Thank God we're done with that. I don't think that's the approach that will work for you long term. You've got to be able to continuously review what we're tracking. Is it accurate? Are we getting good information? All the way from how we collect it to how we process it to how we report it back to the folks that need to know whether it's making active decisions in the field or tying it back to really how we would estimate the next project. Some food for thought there. I'm going to hang around afterwards here for a few minutes, but thank you guys for sitting in and participating this afternoon.